Hi guys, and welcome back to my Zero to KSM Challenge Series, Episode 3. As stated last episode, the goal this week is to get as close as possible to 1500 rating. As I managed to run quite a lot of dungeons for this week, I've decided I'll split up the episodes a little, just so that I can go into more detail for each dungeon, while also giving myself more time to edit the episodes. Please let me know if you prefer this over the shorter, more concise episodes. We're starting this week at 403 item level and 877 rating. The affixes this week are Fortified, Afflicted, and Raging. This means that the groups I make this week need to have at least 2 dispels to deal with the Afflicted affix, but I do like to play it safe and prefer having 3 dispels, with 1 being the healer and 2 being DPS, as sometimes the healer can be a little overwhelmed with healing going on and not have the GCD to spare for the Afflicted adds. Starting the week off, the first thing I always like to do after reset is open my Great Vault. Since I had completed 8 dungeons the week prior, I had 3 options to choose from of varying item levels. The options were a Talisman of the Crag Shaper, a good defensive trinket from Neltarhus' Lair, a Choker of Stolen Thunder from Vortex Pinnacle, and the final option was a Shoulder tier piece. As I've yet to achieve a 4 set, which is very strong for Demon Hunter this season, I opted for the tier shoulders to bring me one step closer. After selecting my items, I began to make my way to Zalara Caverns to complete a few dailies. Starting off with the weekly Sniff Sneaking map, I got a minor upgrade with a 402 Sunless Belt. I also completed a few Dragon Riding World quests for a little gold while applying to dungeon groups. I wanted to start with a warm-up run, looking for a dungeon in the 10 to 12 range. I applied to a few different groups and eventually got accepted into a 10 plus Neltarhus. I know recently the Neltarhus dungeon had some changes in the way that the chains effects works and no longer affect every mob. So rather than using the chain strategy I do on my main, which would be pulling the mobs on the left side and then the mobs on the right side, dragging them to chains and killing them that way, I decided that me being unsure with which mobs can still be affected by the chains and my still somewhat low item level, that I would play it safe and just do a standard pull, taking the Wardens and the first big pack together. From there on, it was just a standard route towards the first boss, Magma Tusk. As this was a fortified week, the bosses are not too threatening compared to the previous weeks. Magma Tusk went down very quickly without any problems and we made our way to the second boss. On the way to the second boss, I did a fairly large pull as I know that the chains can affect all of the mobs in this area, which seemed to help speed up the run significantly. Unfortunately, only me and the shaman seemed to know how the chains work, as everybody else seemed to ignore them. Despite this, we still managed to get the mobs down without too many issues. On the second boss, during the chains, I broke one of the chains by pulling the boss into it, but another DPS also ran through the boss, causing us to get a double chain dot on the first set of chains. But luckily the healer managed to keep up with it and the boss fell relatively easily. I normally like to break a single chain first and then a double chain, as once the boss is stunned there is no additional damage coming out besides the dot, which makes it much more manageable. This is of course depending on the level of the key and is riskier on a tyrannical week. If you want to play it safe, you can always just break one chain, wait for the dot to drop and break the next one. After Chagath, I made another big pull, pulling everything in the next room to the chain as the cooldown for the chains had expired, meaning we could use them again to quickly burst down the adds. Again, only me and the shaman seemed to use the chains, unfortunately, but we did still manage to kill everything without any deaths. Nothing else eventful happened on the way to the Forge Master. I did pull the Iron Torch Commander, which I normally skip on higher level keys, but otherwise the route was fairly standard on the way. We did have our first and only death of the run just before jumping down into the Forge area. Jumping down into the Forge Master's area, I pulled both packs of the blacksmiths with the flares, and once they got low, chain pulled into the boss. The Forge Master went down without any issues and we quickly made our way to the final boss, Warlord Saga. The trash on the way to the final boss isn't too difficult. The Blaze Wings can put out a lot of AoE damage and it helps your healer a lot if you interrupt the Lava Mancers. On the final boss, there's one main mechanic to look out for, and that is the Magma Shield ability. The boss puts a big shield on himself and begins casting a hard-hitting AoE and dropping lots of swirls on the ground to avoid. To deal with this mechanic, the boss will spawn small piles of gold around the room, which when picked up will give you an extra action button that will do large damage to the boss's shield. You can pick up the action before the shield ability is being cast. allowing you to cast the extra action just as he's about to finish the shield cast, letting you instantly break the shield. Since this was a very low level key, the boss was defeated very quickly and we ended up 2 chests in the run, bringing me up to a Mythic Plus rating of 1018, and I also got a lucky 415 cape, bringing me up to 406 item level in total. I believe we could have 3 chested this run if I was a bit more aggressive on pulls and if everyone utilised the chains. However, for a warm-up dungeon, I feel this went relatively smooth. After completing the run, I immediately started looking for another group. Due to my low item level, getting invited into groups for higher level keys can take a little bit of time. However, I eventually got invited into a plus 11 Underrot. The dungeon started off well with no issues on the way to the first boss, nor on the first boss itself. The route I took is a fairly standard route, nothing out of the ordinary. Things were going great. But then we had our first mistake. Just after the first boss, I made my usual pulls of lashes and living rots. Unfortunately, someone managed to pull the ticks and the maggot. The ticks explode when they die and also leave a hard-hitting, stacking debuff each time they attack. Unfortunately, it was a little bit more than me or my healer could handle, leading us to our first wipe of the dungeon. Running back and making the same pull, I no longer had to worry about someone pulling the ticks as they were all dead. While clearing out the trash on the way to the second boss, Cragmaw. Some of the trash in this room can be quite dangerous. Firstly, there are 2 abilities that need to be interrupted, the first being the Lash's Decaying Mind and the Brood Swarmer's Screech. Additionally, the maggots can do a very hard-hitting frontal cone ability. The final thing to look out for is the Blood Swarmer's Fixate ability, which causes the mob to focus on a specific target, chasing them and dealing damage while in melee. It was here where we had a few more deaths due to a mixture of casts going out, the healer dying to fixate, and the afflicted ads being able to get out a double debuff, meaning we had a 200% less haste. I managed to keep myself up throughout these pulls, despite losing the healer and all of the DPS due to the high self-healing demon hunters can produce. In total, between the first and second bosses, we had managed to amass 10 deaths. The second boss, Cragmaw, can be a little annoying to deal with as every time he casts an ability, he spawns some maggots on the ground that need to be stepped on, otherwise they will transform into the ticks that managed to wipe our group earlier. I like to pull the boss to one of the sides of the rooms so that his charge is stopped with him running into something and leaving the maggots less spread out, which leads to not having to move around as much and letting us have more uptime on the boss. One additional thing that I attempted to do on this boss is to leap away during his indigestion ability to avoid the large amount of damage that this ability normally does. We managed to get the boss down just as he started his second tantrum. On the way to Sporecrawler Zanak, nothing much happened. There is only 3 pulls between the second and third boss. Sporecrawler himself can be a little tricky if people don't know how to deal with the small green mushrooms. With the first Festering Harvest was about to cast, the hunter popped his immunity and ran through a large amount of mushrooms. I also soaked the 1 remaining mushroom before the harvest went off. At this point the boss was also quite low, so I knew that we wouldn't be getting a second harvest. The boss quickly fell and we moved on to make our way to the 4th boss. On the way to the final boss, we did have 1 more wipe due to too many casts going out from the grotesque horror, which slowly killed the rest of the group. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to self-sustain enough to survive the incoming damage. Other than this wipe, there was no more deaths on the way to the final boss. The final boss itself went down quite easily with only 1 death. I did try to make sure the group had enough room to bait the breath in the direction we just came from, however not all of them did this, resulting in some strangely placed breaths. Despite this, we got the boss down with only 1 death towards the end, resulting in a 2 chest and bringing my rating up to 1068. No loot from this dungeon though. The final dungeon for this Sunday was my own key, a plus 13 Halls of Infusion. I was a little worried about this dungeon as it was a fortified week and some of the ads before the 3rd boss can hit very hard. My only concern for the comp that I had picked resulted in us only having 2 dispels for the afflicted affix and no combat res, but I hope that it wouldn't be an issue. Up to and including the first boss, not much happened. Everything went very smoothly. The boss was down quickly, however after the first boss we did have our first death. The Shadow Priest managed to take aggro of a mob and it killed him before I had noticed what had happened. But other than this one death, everything went well, all the way through to and including the second boss, the Gulping Goliath. After the Goliath, it was here now that we reached the pack of mobs I was most cautious of. The packs on the way to the third boss can hit very hard, have heals that need to be interrupted, and ground effects that need to be avoided. In addition to all of this, the Drakes put out a nasty dot onto the whole group as well, as a hard-hitting frontal breath. However, the first few packs went very well, until we got to the final pack before the next boss and we had a warrior charge in before I had been able to establish any aggro, which caused him to die almost instantly. Despite almost dying myself, we managed to get the pack down and move on to the third boss. The third boss itself can be a problem for some groups, as multiple things can go wrong. This could be due to the people hiding behind the cracked ice blocks which explodes when Hailstorm is cast, having the Frost Cyclone crack or breaking one of the ice blocks, and the ability Glacial Surge, which can sometimes be a little tricky to see as it is an icy blue indicator on an icy ground. My concerns weren't warranted though, as the group managed to down the boss without any deaths and no issues at all. The final part to clear before reaching the last boss in the gauntlet, where again many things can go wrong, from falling off the platform to getting hit by a wave. It's very easy for one mistake to cascade and cause a chain of reaction that wipes the group here. I find dodging the waves as a tank a little more tricky, as I tend to have my back towards them, so I'm facing mobs away from the party. Luckily, we had no issues and reached the primal tsunami with no deaths. On the first attempt, at the start of the fight, I died very early on. I got hit by the knockback and into one of the globules around the room, causing me to take large damage, which then caused me to panic and leap inside the boss's hitbox, causing even further damage and killing me, which resulted in everyone else dying. Unfortunately, we were lacking a combat res in this group, so this resulted in a wipe. The second attempt, however, went much better, and we got the boss down. We managed to 2-chest the dungeon. I didn't get any loot this time, but at least it further increased my Mythic Plus rating to 1139. My key turned into an Underrot 15. The very next day, I formed a group for this key, and on the first big pull of the dungeon, we lost our healer as they stood inside the Maggot's Breath attack, causing them to die very quickly. As I had all of my cooldowns going still, and being at the start of the dungeon, we managed to recover and kill the cluster of mobs without anyone else dying. Other than this first initial pull, there were no problems for the other 2 pulls to the first boss. I find the first boss to be a very easy boss to manage, provided you interrupt the Blood Bolt and avoid the Creeping Rot and Sanguine Feast. Unfortunately, our warrior didn't get the memo and got hit by a Creeping Rot from the Blood Mirror clone, and as a result died immediately. The boss was at 35% health at this point, so it wasn't too concerning, and we quickly finished it off with no more deaths. Making our way to Cragmaw, I did my usual pull, once again, of Lashes and Rots, except this time the ticks did not get pulled. We continued clearing out Cragmaw's room when we lost the Druid. Somehow he had managed to pull the ticks that we had already avoided. Needless to say, he died quite quickly and I picked up the mobs he aggroed. I tried my best to self-sustain as much as I could, even tried to kite the pack of mobs, but it was still too much for us. I died and the rest of the group followed. After running back, we cleared out the rest of the trash in the room and took on Cragmaw. By this point we had amassed a total of 7 deaths. Cragmaw, however, went down without much of a fight. We continued making our way through the dungeon, killing Sporecaller without any issues, and it seems like the problems for this run were over. Or so I thought. As we progressed towards the Unbound Abomination, 1 pack before the final trash pull, our Shadow Priest got hit by a maddening gaze, and then the Horror managed to get off a Dark Echoes cast almost immediately after, causing him to die. We finished the pack and rezzed the priest before moving on to the final pack of the dungeon. This pack consists of 1 Horror and 2 Faceless Corruptors. Our Shaman Healer took a double maddening gaze to the face and died, followed by our Warrior dying to a Tentacle Slam shortly after. Despite being a healer and a DPS down, we still managed to finish killing the pack and waited for the dead to regroup with us before heading down to the final boss, the Unbound Abomination. The boss went down without any problems at all, and we ended up 2-chesting the dungeon, bringing my rating up to 1181. However, I received no loot once again. My key upgraded into a Neltarhus 17, which I quickly made a group for. It was here where I thought I might be testing the limits of my item level. The group started off strong, only having one death on the way to Magma Tusk. The Shadow Priest didn't manage to avoid one of the squirrels on the ground and promptly died. Magma Tusk itself went very well. Although sometimes the charges could have been baited better, the boss died without any problems at all, making our way to the second boss, Chargath. I made a fairly large pull and dragged the mobs to the chains. The Paladin and Hunter used the chains and we made short work of the pull. Following that pull, 3 members of the group, myself included, still did not have a cooldown for the chains, so I once again made another very large pull, pulling as much as I could all the way to the second boss, Chargath. This pull didn't go too well. I died before I could use the chain to stun the mobs. Fortunately, the 2 priests managed to chain the group and deal a large amount of damage to them before the Shadow Priest died. I did get a combat res, however by this point both DPS died before I could get aggro, and I began to kite the mobs backwards. We did eventually clear the pack without having to reset. This took us to 5 deaths. On the run back, we picked up some trash mobs that were missed before taking on Chargath. Chargath himself went down without any problems at all. Going into the next room, I pulled all of the trash and brought them to the chain as our cooldowns were up. I was having a very hard time clicking the chain on this pack as the mobs would continually stand on top of it. However, the healer and 2 DPS managed to use it and the pack died very quickly. After climbing the stairs, we killed a few packs without any issues. However, on the 3rd pack, the healer pulled some more mobs to make a bigger pack, and the hunter died from standing in the Scorching Breath ability. The hunter did get a combat res, only to die again shortly after. I was running low on defensives, eventually dying to the pack as well, followed by the Shadow Priest. The Paladin and the healer continued to kite the pack backwards. I caught up with them and we finished off the remaining mobs. So far, a little bit of a messy run it seems, but the group was committed to getting this done. Things were going great, until I jumped down into the forge area and pulled both packs of trash with the blacksmiths. This was going to be a terrible mistake. I got greedy, but thought that I could manage it, as I had all of my cooldowns. I was wrong, and died, and the rest of the group shortly followed. It was here that the Shadow Priest left and the group fell apart. With my newly downgraded 16 key, I made a new group to attempt the same dungeon again. With the recent failure of the 17, I was determined to finish the run this time. At the start of the dungeon, we had an over-eager paladin pull aggro while I was grouping the mobs and die. I made sure to pick up the mobs, he over-aggroed, and we killed the pack without any issue. It does feel like Demon Hunter can be a little slow to get the initial threat on AoE groups, as there is a little bit of build-up to its damage. It was here, after the first few packs, that I once again got greedy, and made a double pack pull. Unfortunately, the mob's Molten Core cast wasn't interrupted, causing too much damage for the healer to keep up and wiping our group. Only 2 minutes in and already at 6 deaths. I was growing a little concerned, but continued to press on. Making the same pull again. Things went much better. However, we did get one more death. One of the mobs put out an AoE spell known as an Explosive Concoction, which needs to be avoided as it cannot be interrupted. Our Boom King and Druid was unfortunately hit by this ability and killed instantly, bringing our total deaths up to 7 before we had reached the first boss. Luckily, there were no more deaths on the way to Magma Tusk. Magma Tusk himself was a very messy kill. Things were going great up until around 25% left on the boss. Magma Tusk did his usual charge, and unfortunately, our healer and warlock didn't manage to avoid the lava waves that spawn and died. As the boss was at 25%, I didn't want to reset. The healer got combat res, and on the next charge, our paladin got killed. Despite having 3 deaths, we managed to down the boss, leaving us at a grand total of 10 deaths. After Magma Tusk, I wanted to make up some time for all the deaths that we had, and made a very big pull, in the hopes of utilizing the chains. Luckily, no issues on this pull, and we got the large pack of mobs down. I slowly continued to pull packs and kill them one by one, waiting for my chain cooldown to expire. Once the cooldown had expired, I made a very large pull again, making sure to pull everything up to Chagath, and bringing them to the chains to kill them. This went very well, and it feels like our messy beginnings this dungeon were not a sign of things to come, and that our troubles were behind us. At least, that's what I hoped. We killed Chagath without any problems, and I proceeded to pull everything in the next room to the chains, as our chains were off cooldown once again. Once I grouped everything and brought them to the chain, the paladin unfortunately stood inside the Magma Fist frontal and died. He got combat rezzed while I chained the group of mobs, followed by the Boomkin's chain. Unfortunately, nobody else seemed to use the chains, and as the pack was almost dead, I died. Fortunately, the group managed to kite and kill the pack. This pull gave us 2 additional deaths, bringing us up to a grand total of 12. I still thought this went smoother than last time. Moving up the stairs on our way to the Forge Master, we continued to clear without too much trouble. However, we did lose the paladin to a scorching breath attack, which he stood in front of. After killing the pack, we rezzed him and pulled the next pack. Unfortunately, the warlock got a little too impatient and pulled the next pack, letting him take aggro and dying very quickly before I could establish my own threat. Once the pack was almost dead, we had a mode of combustion cast go off just before I could interrupt it, and the druid who got the debuff also got the axe debuff at the same time, causing him to die, bringing our total deaths up to 15. While killing the lava bearers that guard the way to jump down after clearing the 3rd boss, the Iron Torch Commander got pulled. This is a mob that I would normally like to skip due to its high health and damage. During the Commander's battery of swirls, our healer got hit and died. Luckily, our combat res came off cooldown and we managed to kill the Commander without any more deaths. The last few packs before the Forge Master, I took it slow to ensure that we had no more unnecessary deaths. Forge Master Goric was going well, up until around 45%, where we lost our Warlock to the Swirl from the Shield ability. Then, at around 20%, we lost our Balanced Druid to an orange swirl from the Furnace. Me and the Paladin and Druid continued to kill the boss, and we got it down without any more issues. This took our total death count to 18. Jumping down to the first room, I pulled the 2 Wardens with the Blaze Wing, where I very quickly died due to missing my mitigation. The Paladin died shortly after, and the rest of the group kited the trash back towards the entrance. The Warlock did die again, unfortunately, before I could get aggro back on all of the mobs. After this pack though, we had no more issues clearing up to the final boss. The start of the final boss, everything seemed to be going perfect. The first Magma Shield phase went great, but the boss did manage to get a second Magma Shield cast out at 10% remaining health. It was here where we lost our Warlock once again. We broke the shield and finished the dungeon with a grand total of 22 deaths. We ended up being almost 4 minutes behind the timer. If you factor in the time lost from deaths and the time lost when running back, I feel like this dungeon could have been timed quite easily. Nevertheless, this took my Mythic Plus rating up to 1244. I also got a very nice chest piece with my best in slot secondary stats. However, I couldn't equip it just yet, as I needed to keep my current chest for the 2 set tier bonus. That's all for this episode. I still have another 8 dungeons that I need to edit from this week, which will be covered in the next episode. All of this is live streamed on my Quick and Twitch channel. Please feel free to drop by and experience the live progression of this challenge. If you enjoyed this video, please give the video a like, comment and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel.